Shalom everyone, and welcome to ReBoot the Root. In this series of teachings, we're going to be looking at the story of Hanukkah. In fact, we're going to be rebooting the story of Hanukkah, giving us an educated understanding of what Hanukkah is through the book of 1st Macabees. So join me, if you will, as we reboot the root and reboot the story of Hanukkah. Shalom. Shalom, and welcome to this episode of ReBoot the Root. Well, we're continuing on in our exciting series about rebooting Hanukkah. And so in the last few episodes, we've been getting kind of heavy in the historical sense of Hanukkah, looking at where does the Hanukkah story come from a world and Hebraic history perspective. So we're going to continue on here in episode 10 about rebooting Hanukkah. So we're going to look at the historical perspective, continuing to look at our historical perspective, that is, about the story of Hanukkah. So we are kind of wrapping up the historical end, and we'll be coming to a close here pretty soon in the next couple of episodes on the historical end, and we're going to be changing gears or changing perspectives about how we're looking at Hanukkah. But for now, we're continuing on in the historical look at Hanukkah as we're rebooting Hanukkah. So last episode, in episode 9, we left off in the story where the Maccabean army was outnumbered by 6-1 by the Seleucid Greek army. So the Seleucid Greek army had 60,000 troops facing the 10,000 man rebel army of the Macabees. And so let's continue on in 1st Maccabees chapter 4, verse 30 through 33. And it reads, "And when he saw that mighty army, he prayed and said," and so this is Judas Maccabeus saying, "Blessed art thou, O Savior of Israel, who didst quell the violence of the mighty man by the hand of thy servant David, and gavest the host of strangers into the hands of Jonathan the son of Saul and his armor bearer." So he's remembering the story of long ago, how David was also victorious in battle. And so at this time, Judas Maccabeus is hoping, at least it appears that he's hoping, to have the same kind of favor in battle. Verse 31, "Shut up this army in the hand of thy people Israel, and let them be confounded in their power and horsemen. Make them to be of no courage, and cause the boldness of their strength to fall away, and let them quake at their destruction. Cast them down with the sword of them that love you, and let all those that know thy name praise thee with thanksgiving." So this sort of passage, when we're looking at it, is basically a prayer of Judah Maccabeus to Yahweh to give him favor, to give him, it's a plea for salvation to come upon his forces to defeat the overwhelming odds of the Seleucid Greeks against them. And so whenever you see a prayer of salvation, they are calling out to Yeshua. Yeshua is salvation. And as you know, Yeshua is another name for Jesus. So they're crying out for salvation. They're crying out to a Savior. And so the Savior of Israel that they're crying out to is evident in Isaiah chapter 43, verses 1 through 3. And it says, "But now thus saith Yahweh that created you, O Jacob, and he that formed you, Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by name, thou art mine. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. For I am the Lord thy God, the Holy One of Israel, thy Savior." So what's happening here is Judas Maccabeus is crying out for salvation for his troops. He's crying out for a Savior. And so one of the things I believe is happening here is that Judas Maccabeus is crying out to Yahweh for mercy. And so mercy in Hebrew is the word hesed. Hesed is mercy, which is defined as loving kindness. So we turn to the article called What is the True Meaning of Mercy? And this is brought to us by theconversation.com. So they define hesed, the Hebrew word, as mercy, which is a loving kindness. So this is what mercy is. This is what God gives us when he gives us mercy. He gives us his loving kindness. In Exodus 20 verse 6, we see this hesed exemplified. It says, and showing mercy to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So this is Yahweh talking to the people of Israel in the 10 commandments in Exodus 20 verse 6, showing mercy to those who keep God's commandments. So this enduring love for Israel speaks of ahava, which refers to God's enduring love for Israel. So I think this is what Judas Maccabeus is counting on, is God's ahava, or God's enduring love for Israel. Turning back to the Macabees story in 1 Maccabees chapter 4 verse 34 through 36, it says, so they joined battle, and there were slain of the host of Lysias about 5,000 men, even before them that were slain. Now when Lysias saw his army put to flight, and the manliness of Judas's soldiers, and how they were ready to live or die valiantly, he went into Antiochia and gathered together a company of strangers, and having made his army greater than it was, he purposed to come again to Judea. So what's possibly happening here is Lysias and his Greek army, they are being conquered, and perhaps what they're doing is they're gathering up maybe some mercenaries, some local mercenaries to help gather into the fight. And it continues on in verse 36. Then said Judas and his brethren, behold, our enemies are discomfited. Let us go up and cleanse and dedicate the sanctuary. So finally we're getting to the part where we're going to get to the part where we actually take over the temple, and that they are going to cleanse it and rededicate it. So in this article, wikipedia.org, the article entitled Beth Zur, it says, prior to retaking and dedicating the Jerusalem temple, the Battle of Zeph Sur, which means the House of Rocks, this battle was fought between the Maccabean rebels and the Seleucid Greeks. The rebels won that battle that directly resulted in retaking the temple. So this Battle of Beth Zur is a pivotal battle that happens to be able to retake the temple and to rededicate it and to cleanse it. The battle was the confrontation between the Seleucid Greek general Lysias and the Maccabees, led by Judas Maccabeus, resulting in the defeat of Lysias and his forces. This victory was followed by the recapture of Jerusalem by the Maccabees. So continuing on in our story of Hanukkah, we go back to the first book of Maccabees, chapter 4, verses 37 through 40. Then said Judas and his brethren, behold, our enemies are discomfited. Let us go up and cleanse and dedicate the sanctuary. Upon this all the host assembled themselves together and went up into Mount Sion. And this is where the temple of Jerusalem is at, is Mount Sion. And when they saw the sanctuary desolate, and the altar profaned, and the gates burned up, and shrubs growing in the courts as in a forest, or in one of the mountains, yea, and the priest's chambers pulled down, they rent their clothes and made great lamentation and cast ashes upon their heads, and fell down flat to the ground upon their faces, and blew an alarm with the trumpets and cried toward heaven. So what's happening here is very evident. The forces of the Maccabeans, the rebels, they actually get to the point to where they're getting ready to take over the Jerusalem temple, to retake it. and they find that the temple is in disarray. It has been abused. It has been tortured. It has been defiled, and so this causes great lamentation among the rebels, to the point where they're gonna have sackcloth and ashes. And this is a typical thing that happens in Hebrew culture, is that whenever people are lamenting, people are mourning, that sadness has happened, perhaps someone has died, or some great travesty has happened, they will rip their clothes and they will put ashes on their heads. And so this is what's happening when the Maccabee forces get to the temple. They find that the temple has been humiliated, so to speak, and so they are lamenting. They're in sorrow. So what happens here is, when they get ready to rededicate the temple, we have to understand that where they are at Mount Sion is actually Jerusalem. And this temple at Jerusalem, we've already identified before in reading the story, and if you've been following the narrative, we have discovered that this temple of Jerusalem is in fact the second temple. This sanctuary that they found there in Jerusalem was found to be desolate and profane. So this abomination that causes a desolation is at the temple is the Greek and the Roman armies with their pagan idols of Zeus and Jupiter on their incense, that literally caused the desolation of the Holy Land. After making Jerusalem desolate, the Greeks converted the temple in Jerusalem into a temple to Zeus as a gesture of thanks and honor to their pagan god. The Romans also did the same thing. And so this bit of information we get from revolution.org. Revolution.org continues to share this with us, that during the Maccabean Wars of the 2nd century BC, which is the Hanukkah story, the Greeks attacked Jerusalem, causing a great slaughter in the city. The Greeks then set up an idol of Zeus, and we see this revisited in the 2nd book of Maccabees in chapter 6, where it says that they sacrificed a pig in the temple in Jerusalem. And we see this at the beginning of the Hanukkah story in 1 Maccabees chapter 1. This act of the abomination of desolation is referred to as a desolating sacrilege. In Maccabees chapter 1 verse 54, the abomination that causes a desolation is also referred to in Daniel chapter 11 verse 31. During the Maccabean Wars, the Greek army desecrated the temple and stopped the regular sacrifices that were happening at the Jerusalem temple, and placed an idol of Zeus on the temple altar. 1 Maccabees 1:54 calls this idol of Zeus a desolating sacrilege on the altar. Thus we get the idea or the concept of the desolation of abomination. What's happening here with rededicating the temple is that we see that before it can be rededicated, that we're finding out what is the state of the temple that the Maccabean forces found it in after all the time of battling the Greeks in their rebellion. So when they get there, they find that the temple had been profaned, desolated, it had not been maintained, and was treated as a forgotten place of architecture. So when we understand what the temple meant to the Jews, the Jews saw the temple as the central focus of their culture and the religion, and in fact the icon of the Jewish people was found in the temple. And so there's this identity that they had with the temple. This is why it was so important to them. In fact, it could have been so much that it was the golden ring, so to speak, that they were going after when fighting the Seleucids. This was the thing that they were trying to obtain in victories, to get back their temple, because it was so It figured so much into their national identity. So the Jews returned to the temple at Mount Zion to find their beloved temple had been abused and its holiness stripped unto profanity. The temple had been set up as a Greek temple. So now what they had to do is that they had to retake the temple and to cleanse it and rededicate it. But this would have to be after some obvious time of lamentation. So we see this in 1 Macabees chapter 4 verse 39, where it says, they rent their clothes and make great lamentation and cast ashes upon their heads. So there's this national time of sorrow for the temple. So at this time, when they're renting their clothes, they're in this time of mourning or indignation. And we see that this indignation or mourning, there's this thing that happens when the death of a relative or an important person, such as we see this, what happens when they lamented for Aaron back in the Torah on their Exodus journey. There was a time when Aaron died, and they lamented and mourned for him for 40 days. So let's take a look at some information that BibleStudiesTools.com shares with us about this renting of clothes. So this renting of clothes is mourning or indignation. Upon the death of a relative or an important person, or when there was a great calamity, it was customary for the Hebrew people to tear their garments. We see this evident also not only with Aaron, but also with Reuben. Reuben rent his clothes when he found that Joseph had been taken from the pit. And this is not Reuben, this is Jacob. Jacob rent his clothes when he found that Joseph had been taken from the pit. No, we find out this happens when, Reuben rents his clothes when he found that Joseph had been taken from the pit after his brothers had sold his brother Joseph into slavery. And we see this in Genesis 37:29, where Reuben rents his clothes when he found that Joseph had been taken from the pit. A messenger came to Eli in 1 Samuel chapter 4 with his clothes rent to tell of the taking of the ark of God and the death of his 2 sons. And then in Matthew 26 verse 65, the high priest rent his garment when Jesus spoke what he thought was blasphemy. GotQuestions.org says in Esther 4:1, for instance, describes Mordecai tearing his clothes, putting on sackcloth and ashes, and walking out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. This was Mordecai's reaction to King Xerxes' declaration giving the wicked Haman authority to destroy the Jews. This is Esther chapter 3 verses 8 through 15. Mordecai was not the only one who had grieved. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews. With fasting, weeping, and wailing, many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther chapter 4 verse 3. The Jews responded to the devastating news concerning their race with sackcloth and ashes, showing their intense grief and distress. GotQuestions.org. Continuing, going back to 1 Macabees, chapter 4, verse 41 through 45. Then Judas appointed certain men to fight against those that were in the fortress until he had cleansed the sanctuary. So he chose priests of blameless conversation, such as had pleasure in the law, who cleansed the sanctuary and bare out the defiled stones into an unclean place. And as they consulted what to do with the altar of burnt offerings, which was profane, they thought it best to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them, because the heathen had defiled it, wherefore they pulled it down. So what is happening here is that the Maccabees, they come unto the defiled temple at Jerusalem, and they had seen that the Greeks had had a great influence over the temple with establishing their altars and their worship unto Zeus. So they found that their temple had further been defiled by the sacrificing of a pig and adultery with a pagan Greek god. So the legitimate high priest had been removed and replaced with a Hellenized priest. In other words, this priest was someone who would play ball or be more favorable with King Antiochus. And so this Hellenized priest was willing to defile himself and do whatever the Greeks told him to do. He was basically the priest in the pocket. So with this corruption in the temple, the Jewish identity had been compromised. Some of the things that had been compromised was the Sabbath, the Torah, and Jewish law being forsaken for a Greek culture. The uncleanliness of a pig was pushed upon the Jews and the temple, thus making the Jews and the temple both unclean. Sacrifices of swine upon the altar would automatically defile the temple, making the temple unclean. And so we were also looking at what happens with Hannah and her sons and Eleazar in this story that's happening at the temple. So let's take a look at that. Let's go to WikipediaArticle.org, the article entitled Eleazar, and we're going to see that they're going to get some information here about what's happening here at the temple from the second book of Maccabees in chapter 6, verse 1831. It says, Eleazar was a Jewish man whose story is portrayed in 2 Maccabees, and verse 18 of chapter 6 describes Eleazar as one of the leading teachers of the law and of distinguished bearing. Under a persecution instigated by Antiochus IV, which is also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, Eleazar was forced to open his mouth and eat pork, but he spat it out and he submitted to flogging. So if we look at 2 Maccabees chapter 6 verses 18 through 19, we see the context or the narrative of the story. Eleazar, one of the principal scribes, an aged man and of well-favored countenance, was constrained to open his mouth and to eat swine's flesh. But he, choosing rather to die gloriously than to live stained with such an abomination, spit it forth and came of his own accord to the torment. There will be a time for each one of us that have an occasion to rise up against our convictions, against our faith, to deny what the world would want us to do, and that we will be given such a challenge as, will we die for our faith, or will we give in and submit ourselves to the world? Let's take a look now at what's happening with the altar that's inside of the temple that was defiled. According to BibleGateway.com, they say this about the altar that was inside of the temple. The altar of burnt offering was also known as the brazen altar. So what happened here at the brazen altar was the offering of clean animals were burnt on this altar and offered up to Yahweh. In the court before the tabernacle, where the people tended, was an altar to which they must bring their sacrifices and on which their priests must offer them to God. It was of wood overlaid with brass. A grate of brass was let into the hollow of the altar, about the middle of which the fire was kept, and the sacrifice thus burnt. It was made of network like a sieve and hung hollow, that the ashes might fall through. And when we talk about the altar, we must also identify what was the altar being used for. So this altar was used for an offering, which in the Hebrew is called the korban, which is a offering up to Yahweh. So the Hebrew word for offering is korban. According to Wikipedia article entitled Korban, the term korban primarily refers to a sacrificial offerings given from humans to God for the purpose of doing homage, winning favor, or securing pardon. The object sacrificed was usually an animal that was ritually slaughtered and then transferred from the human to the divine realm of being by being burned on the altar. So we've already identified that the offering is called the korban, but we have a specific burnt offering that was put on the altar of the burnt offering, which was called the olah. The olah is the burnt offering, and that olah was put on the brazen altar at the temple. The table or altar had been profaned in the temple and defiled with offerings made to another god with unclean animals such as the swine. An acceptable offering to Yahweh would be those consisted of bulls, goats, or sheep. What is not accepted would be the swine. That is an abomination. That is an abominable offering. And so the offerings usually were male domesticated animals that were free of blemish. The Wikipedia article entitled Solomon's Temple says, according to the biblical narrative, Solomon's Temple, also known as the First Temple, was a temple in Jerusalem which was called the Beit HaMakadesh, built under King Solomon's reign and completed in 957 BC. The temple was looted and then destroyed in 587 BC at the hands of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. So this was the temple of Solomon that had been looted and destroyed when the southern kingdom of Israel, or the southern kingdom of Israel known as Judah, was conquered by the Babylonians, and they were taken away into captivity. According to the Wikipedia article Solomon's Temple, it continues to say that the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament, describes how Solomon's father David, the great warrior king, united the Israelite tribes, captured Jerusalem, and brought the Israelites' central artifact, the Ark of the Covenant, into the city. David chose Mount Moriah in Jerusalem as the site for a future temple to house the Ark, today known as the Temple Mount or Haram Asharif. However, God would not let him build the temple, for he had shed much blood. So this is talking about David. David was not allowed to build the temple, but his son Solomon was. So this Mount Moriah, the choice site for building the temple by Solomon, is also the site of where Yeshua or Jesus would later be crucified. And Mount Moriah is also the site where Abraham takes his son Isaac to be sacrificed. And this all happens on Mount Moriah. So Mount Moriah is a very intriguing place because a lot of things are going on there. First time we see Mount Moriah used is with Abraham and Isaac. Then we see that Mount Moriah is the chosen site for the temple of Solomon. And then later on in the New Testament, we see that Mount Moriah becomes the crucifixion site for Jesus. So when we take a look at Solomon's temple, we see that there are some very interesting facts that go along with this temple. And we see that Solomon's temple was 90 feet long and 30 feet wide and 40 feet high. Solomon began construction of this temple 490 years after Israel came out of Egypt. And so this temple that is built by Solomon comes after Israel had been using the tabernacle, which is the temporary temple, for about 400 years. So 400 years after they were using the tabernacle, along comes the permanent structure, which is the temple. The temple site, like I said earlier, was located on Mount Moriah, where Abraham had offered Isaac. And so this temple that Solomon built took about 7 years to build, and the cost of the temple in today's money would be anywhere from $3 to $6 billion. So this is some interesting facts about the temple, and it kind of gives us a little bit of extra information about what's happening with this temple, to kind of know how important it was, how magnificent it was, and how much it meant to the Jewish people. It meant so much to their identity, they were willing to die for it and go to war for it. Well, this is a good place to stop for this episode 10 of Rebooting Hanukkah, and we'll pick up again next time in episode 11 as we continue to reboot the story of Hanukkah. So for now, I'll say shalom and come back as we reboot the root. Shalom.